I never expected to get tangled in an HOA nightmare, especially not in a place that looked like the perfect, peaceful neighborhood. But that's exactly where I ended up, Meadowlark Estates, a picture-perfect suburb with manicured lawns, picket fences, and a homeowners association that could rival a military regiment. I moved here after inheriting the property from my late aunt, who adored the quiet charm of the community. Coming from a bustling city, I was looking forward to a slower pace and a sense of stability. My aunt's home held fond childhood memories, holidays spent running through the backyard, summer afternoons lounging under the old oak tree. I wanted to keep her spirit alive, so even though I wasn't sure about the strict HOA rules, I decided to settle in. Right away, the contrast was clear. Neighbors politely waved as they passed, but behind their friendly nods lurked a hint of caution. I'd hear snippets of conversation about HOA citations or Karen wrote me up again, and I couldn't help but wonder who this Karen was and what she was capable of. It felt like I'd stepped into a tight-knit world where everyone was on edge, carefully following every rule to avoid trouble. Still, I was determined to make the best of it. The house was cozy, the street was quiet, and I actually looked forward to meeting new neighbors. Little did I know, the biggest threat to my fresh start would arrive soon. It would come in the form of a stern woman in a crisp HOA polo shirt, armed with a clipboard and an uncanny knack for stirring up chaos. It didn't take long for me to figure out who Karen was. During my first week, I walked out to my mailbox one morning and nearly dropped my keys when I saw a woman meticulously measuring the distance between my curb and my grass. She wore a crisp polo shirt with the HOA logo embroidered over the heart, and her gaze was laser-focused on the tape measure in her hand. "Oh, hello there," I said, trying to sound friendly. "Can I help you with something?" She looked up, startled, as though I'd caught her in the act of something far more serious than measuring a patch of grass. In a second, her expression morphed into a polite but tight-lipped smile. "I'm Karen, the head of our homeowners association board. Just checking if everything is up to code," she said in a tone that suggested she doubted it ever would be. I introduced myself, and she instantly launched into a monologue about the community's stringent rules, how garden gnomes were restricted to 2 per property, how each lawn must be uniformly mowed, how fences couldn't exceed a certain height. She even hinted that my aunt's house might be grandfathered into some questionable modifications, but she let it slide for now. Her words were as precise as the lines on her measuring tape, and I felt an uneasy twist in my stomach. It was as if she'd been waiting for me to show up so she could scrutinize my every move. Neighbors had whispered about her, a force of nature in Meadowlark Estates who took pleasure in enforcing regulations down to the smallest detail. Over the following days, I saw Karen all over the neighborhood, biking around the cul-de-sac while scribbling on her clipboard, knocking on doors to drop off kind reminders about landscaping infractions. People pretended not to notice, or they quickly ducked inside when they spotted her approaching. A few, like my next-door neighbor Cindy, warned me that Karen was famous for threatening fines at the drop of a hat. "She's got the entire HOA in her pocket," Cindy confided one afternoon, glancing nervously out her window as Karen's bike cruised by. "We're all just too scared to rock the boat." I tried to brush it off at first, figuring she just took her role seriously. But beneath her outward politeness, there was an undercurrent of power. She seemed to relish the authority the HOA gave her, and I had a sneaking suspicion she'd wield it against me if given any excuse. The question was, how far would she go? I was about to find out that the answer was further than I ever could have imagined. It started innocently enough. An official-looking envelope slipped under my front door. At first, I assumed it was just more HOA paperwork or perhaps a newsletter about an upcoming neighborhood event. Instead, I found a bold stamped notice demanding that I vacate the premises immediately for purported gross violations of community standards. What on earth? I muttered, scanning the text. Words like breach, noncompliance, and eviction jumped out at me. My throat went dry. I headed straight outside to confront the situation, adrenaline pumping. And sure enough, I spotted Karen standing on the sidewalk with her clipboard in hand. She was mid-conversation with a passing neighbor, but snapped her head toward me when she heard my footsteps. "Karen," I called, trying not to sound as panicked as I felt. "What is this letter supposed to mean?" I waved the notice in the air. Her eyes flicked to the paper. "Oh, that's merely a formal notification," she said, her tone clipped. "We've identified several infractions on your property. Unapproved paint color on the shutters, a potential violation with your front yard decor, and I've reason to believe your house might exceed the maximum square footage allowed in the original building permit." My mind spun. Paint color? Decor? And how can the house be too big if it was built decades ago? I'm not sure what you're talking about. This home belonged to my aunt for years. No one ever mentioned these issues before. Karen shrugged, an air of superiority wafting off of her. Well, it's newly under your name now. The HOA can move to evict if you're unwilling or unable to rectify these substantial concerns. You'll need to leave until it's resolved. My chest tightened. Evict me? I'm sorry, but this is my home. And I don't believe you can just force me out, I said, attempting to keep my voice steady. She tapped her pen on the clipboard. The community grants the HOA considerable power. I suggest you consult the regulations if you doubt me. Her lips curved into a small, triumphant smile. Don't worry, there'll be a hearing, though I doubt you'll be able to remedy everything in time. With that, Karen strode off, leaving me reeling on my own front lawn. As I stared at the notice, a cold wave of dread washed over me. It felt surreal and ominous, like a nightmare. Could she really kick me out for some paint color and yard decorations? Fighting the knots in my stomach, I resolved to fight back. This was my home, my inheritance, and no overzealous HOA board member was going to push me around. I just had no idea yet that the key to my defense was hidden in a dusty stack of paperwork I'd almost forgotten about. In my scramble to figure out how to fight Karen's eviction threat, I dug into every piece of paper related to my aunt's estate. I had boxes of old documents, utility bills, mortgage statements, letters from lawyers, most of which I'd only skimmed when I first moved in. Now, I sifted through them with renewed urgency, searching for anything that could prove Karen didn't have a leg to stand on. I was up late one night, papers spread across my dining room table, a mug of coffee growing cold beside me. My frustration mounted with each page that turned out to be a dead end, just more HOA notices, insurance forms, or outdated property assessments. It felt like I was trying to put together a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Then I hit upon something unusual, a small folder labeled investment/property assets. Inside was a deed for a second property, one I'd never seen before. Curious, I read closer. Address, name of the owner, the lot number. It didn't immediately click, but then I saw the occupant's name, Karen. I blinked, thinking maybe I was mixing up two different Karens in town. But no, there was her full name and signature, clear as day. My aunt had apparently acquired this house years ago, maybe as an investment or a favor to someone. She must have kept it quiet because I'd never heard mention of it before. A chill coursed through me as I realized the implications. Did that mean I actually owned Karen's house? Maybe she was just renting, or on some lease-to-own agreement. The deed suggested my aunt was still the sole owner, and now that inheritance had passed to me. Swallowing hard, I cross-referenced the information. Sure enough, the property number and address matched the very home where Karen lived, where she had presumably been holding me hostage with ridiculous HOA citations. I stare at the papers, heart thumping. This was significant. A dozen questions buzzed through my mind. How did Karen not know? Or did she know and just assume I wouldn't figure it out? My head spun with scenarios. Perhaps Karen had been paying rent or some arrangement existed that she believed gave her claim over the property. But the deed made it clear. Legally, I was in charge. I sat back, exhaling a shaky breath. One thing was certain, Karen's threat to evict me from a house I owned outright felt downright absurd now. In fact, this discovery might be my golden ticket out of her meddling. I just had to confirm every detail, double-check with a lawyer, make sure it was airtight. As I gathered the papers, carefully placing them into a fresh folder, a small surge of confidence pushed away the earlier fear. If Karen thought she had the upper hand, she was in for a rude awakening. Because if everything checked out, she was living on my property, and I wasn't the one who was going to be evicted. Armed with the deed and a renewed sense of determination, I arranged a meeting with a local attorney the very next day. We combed through the documents together, and to my relief and a bit of shock, my suspicions were confirmed. I was indeed the legal owner of Karen's house. My aunt had purchased it years ago, and Karen had been living there under some kind of lease agreement that was never formally updated or recorded in her name. What do I do now? I asked the attorney, feeling a swirl of emotions. Part of me was elated, but another part was uneasy. Evicting someone wasn't exactly my style, and I didn't want to stoop to Karen's level, yet she was actively trying to throw me out of my own home. The attorney, a calm woman with years of property law experience, gave me a measured look. You have every right to either renegotiate her lease or terminate it if she continues to harass you. Legally, you hold all the cards. The question is, how do you want to handle it? I left the office feeling both empowered and slightly guilty. Still, I couldn't ignore the fact that Karen had gone for my throat first. If she'd asked for a civil conversation, maybe we'd have worked something out. But she'd ambushed me with a bogus eviction threat. I decided it was time she learned the real score. The confrontation happened on a bright Saturday afternoon. Karen was outside measuring someone else's lawn when I found her, a tape measure snapping in her hands like a weapon. As I approached, my heart pounded, but I kept my voice steady. "Karen," I said, startling her enough that she nearly dropped the tape. "We need to talk. About your house?" She gave me a condescending glance, like she always did. "Unless you've decided to comply with the HOA's demands, I'm not sure we have anything to discuss." I took a breath, remembering the attorney's advice. Stay calm, state the facts. "Actually, we do. It turns out, I own the house you're living in." Her face froze, eyebrows drawn together in confusion. "What are you talking about?" I held up a copy of the deed. My aunt purchased your house years ago. I inherited it, and now you're trying to evict me from my property? I'd say that's a conflict of interest." Karen's cheeks reddened. She tried to brush it off with a laugh, but there was no missing the flicker of panic in her eyes. This must be some mistake. I've been paying a mortgage for years. According to the records, it looks more like you were paying rent. Maybe you got scammed, or maybe you knew. Either way, the deed is in my name. Legally, I'm your landlord." She opened her mouth to argue, but no sound came out, just an angry sputter. In that moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Because the image of that eviction letter and the audacity it took to threaten me still burned in my mind. "So here's what's going to happen," I continued quietly. "I'd love to work something out, but if you keep harassing me and trying to force me out of my home, I'll have no choice but to terminate your lease. And then you'll be the one facing eviction." Her lips trembled. "You wouldn't dare." I lifted a brow. "I wouldn't have to dare if you hadn't come after me first." With that, I turned on my heel, leaving her standing there stunned. My heart hammered in my chest from the intensity of it all, but there was a clarity in my mind that felt almost liberating. For once, Karen wasn't the one holding all the power, and I had a suspicion she knew she'd just lost the upper hand in a big way. In the days that followed our confrontation, the entire tone of the neighborhood shifted. News traveled fast. Neighbors whispered stories about Karen's sudden change of heart, how she'd stopped her usual drive-by inspections, how she no longer lurked around with her tape measure in hand. For the first time since I moved in, I felt like I could walk down the street without worrying about being ambushed by her endless criticisms. I decided to put the final nail in the coffin of our feud by inviting Karen for a sit-down discussion at my home. Well, our home, I guess you could say, since I owned the roof over her head, too. She arrived with visible trepidation, fidgeting with a folder of HOA documents as though they were a shield. But I'd come prepared with legal documents and a calm demeanor. "Karen, I'm willing to negotiate a new lease for you," I began, keeping my voice level. "I'm not looking to evict anyone unless I'm forced to. But if we're going to coexist in this neighborhood, we need mutual respect." Her face tightened, but she nodded. Over the next hour, we hashed out new terms, ones that acknowledged her interest in maintaining the neighborhood's aesthetic while ensuring I had the freedom to live peacefully. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. She threatened to evict me, yet here we were, setting conditions for her continued residence. After that meeting, Karen's presence in the HOA changed drastically. She stopped handing out frivolous citations and stepped down from her leadership role, citing a desire for personal time to reevaluate her duties. Most residents breathed a collective sigh of relief. Surprisingly, some neighbors later confided that they felt sorry for her. Without the HOA, Karen seemed lost. All that scrutiny and control had been her way of coping with her own insecurities. As for me, I finally settled into the home I'd inherited, free to repaint shutters or plant garden gnomes, whatever I pleased, without a scolding letter in my mailbox. I could focus on honoring my aunt's memory, enjoying the peaceful suburban life she treasured. People in Meadowlark Estates still chat about the day Karen tried to evict the new resident and ended up discovering he was her landlord. It's practically neighborhood lore now, often retold with a mixture of disbelief and amusement. And while Karen keeps a low profile these days, she's learned the hard way that overstepping boundaries can lead to a reckoning, especially when the person you're pushing around holds the deed to your front door. In the end, we both got a lesson in boundaries. For me, it was a reminder that standing up for your rights and doing a bit of digging can save you from being bullied into submission. For Karen, it was a humbling experience in respecting others' property and accepting that what goes around eventually comes around. A few weeks after the dust settled, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened while tending to a new garden bed out front, one that Karen used to insist was too unorthodox for Meadowlark Estates. Now, without her constant scrutiny, I felt a freedom I hadn't known since moving here. Life in the neighborhood slowly returned to normal. Kids played kickball in the cul-de-sac without fear of being reprimanded for noise pollution. Neighbors began chatting more openly, sharing jokes about the time Karen tried to evict the guy who owned her house. Even the HOA itself softened, introducing a more balanced set of guidelines that encouraged individuality as long as basic safety and courtesy were upheld. Rumors circulated that Karen was spending more time traveling. Some said she was visiting family out of state. Others hinted she was looking for a fresh start elsewhere. A few neighbors mentioned seeing her leave early in the mornings, quietly and without ceremony, as if she were trying to avoid attention. Occasionally, we'd cross paths. She'd give me a stiff nod, I'd nod back. It wasn't friendship, but it was peace. For me, life in my aunt's house began to feel like the haven I'd hoped it would be. I painted the shutters a cheerful teal and installed a row of whimsical garden statues along the walkway. The best part? No one complained. In fact, a few neighbors stopped by to say how much they liked the splash of color. Late one afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, I sat on the porch steps, enjoying the gentle breeze. I thought about how close I'd come to giving in, packing up and leaving because of one person's overreach. Instead, I discovered a twist of fate that empowered me to stand my ground. It was a reminder that sometimes the scariest challenges reveal hidden strengths and hidden truths. That evening, I raised a glass of lemonade to the memory of my aunt, grateful for the gift she'd left me, one that extended far beyond mere property. She had, in a way, forced me to learn the value of defending what's mine and to see that sometimes the loudest bullies are standing on shaky ground themselves. And so, in Meadowlark Estates, I found not just a house, but a home, a place where my neighbors and I could coexist without a looming sense of fear or judgment. I realized that real community doesn't come from strict rules and power trips. It grows from understanding and respect. And as the sunset painted the sky in brilliant colors, I felt an overwhelming sense of contentment, knowing I'd helped nudge this neighborhood a little closer to that ideal.